Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on which coast you're logging in from. As Catherine mentioned, we'd like this session to be as interactive as possible, so please submit questions through the chat interface, and I'll be selecting questions as we go along, and we'll also have a Q&A segment at the end of today's webcast. So early and often with the questions, and I will do everything I can to bubble those up appropriately. A few opening notes before I turn it over to Julie and Bill. Julie Baher is the Experienced Design Manager for the Creative Suite at Adobe. She teaches online courses on Internet user experience and e-commerce. Prior to Adobe, she worked at Xerox doing both interaction design and user research. She also worked for Don Norman at Unext, where she founded the User Experience Group. Bill Westerman is co-founder of Create with Context, a strategic design and research firm focused on web, mobile, consumer electronics, and desktop applications. Create with Context combines primary research, idea generation, concept development, and user-centric design to link customer needs through to digital design. Bill's recent clients include Accenture, Adobe, Panasonic, and Yahoo, as well as a variety of early-stage startups. We're very happy to have them both here today. So Julie and Bill, thank you for being with us.
Great. Thanks, Mac.
Good morning.
So welcome to the webinar. We're going to be talking about creative use in digital publishing. And there are three parts to our talk. First, we'll give you a little background on why here at Adobe we were interested in looking at youth. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the trends going on that we've been seeing from some research, from some third-party research. And then we want to present work that we did working with Bill at Create with Context, going out, meeting some youth, and we've put together some case studies to share with you on that. And we will be happy to take questions as we go, so please chime in. So why was youth interesting to Adobe? This project kicked off when we did some work with the Photoshop team, and we wanted to really think about the next generation. We tend to have a much older customer base of our professional users, but we really wanted to think about what's the next generation going to mean for publishing, for digital imaging. And so we thought, well, why don't we go out and talk to some high school students? Let's find our customers before they actually maybe become our customers. And so we were really interested in this next generation, the things they're doing in MySpace, Facebook, Twitter, all the new ways that young people have been publishing. And we thought this would be interesting because it has been a change. There's changes in the tools. Things are more accessible to people. It's a more fluid process of publishing where people can do it, when they want in small bits. And the other interesting thing, too, for us is that a lot of the publishing and things that we see people doing, there's a whole social component to it, and there's also a huge component of self-expression. So these were the big themes that interested us and put us into the study, and we were also interested in to look at what tools people were using and how they were learning about the tools and learning how to use the tools. And so now I want to give you a little background. This is from the Pew Internet and American Life Project, a study that from about a year ago. So some of the trends going on, this goes from 2004 to 2007. So there's this trend where teens are creating more and more content on the Internet. So it's now the norm that this is something that they're doing. And they're doing this in a public space, not just on their local machine. And they're also sharing their artistic creations. So these are things that we'll come back to later, where they're making things that are more creative and self-expression. So it's not just sending emails or text messaging friends, but they're really creating original pieces. And the other thing they're doing in these creations is that they're remixing content. So more and more, from 1 out of 5 in 2004 to now 1 out of 4 in 2007, how they're going about creating things is finding different other things and mashing them together as their work. And another theme that interested us is that the things that they're posting online, they're receiving feedback on it. So it's not just things they're putting out and leaving, but things that they're getting feedback on and actually interested in the feedback. So when we thought about this study, the things that interested us were learning more about the teens, what kind of media they're creating, what motivates them, how do they decide what they're interested in sharing versus not sharing, what things do they want to keep private, how do they go about making the things they make, how do they learn to make the things they make? We had a lot of questions. And how do they find out about tools and sites, websites where they're doing this work? And so this is where we partnered with Create with Context, and I have Bill Westerman from Create with Context here to design this study and help run the study for us. Bill?
Thanks, Julie. So just want to talk a little bit before we dive into the actual findings themselves. I want to talk a little bit about how we structured the research. What we're looking for was not to get a kind of a representative sample of all youth, but instead we're actually wanting to focus in particular on a particular segment of youth. And that was youth that are creative and putting things out there for others to see. So it's not just that they're creating it and keeping it themselves, or maybe showing it to their friends, but these are people who are putting things out on the internet with the intent that other people see them and react to them and work with them and riff on them and that type of thing. So we specifically looked for people that worked like that. The way we did the research is a method that we find quite useful for this type of research, is that we went out into these youth's homes. It happened to be in the California area, went around their houses and spent time with them, about a couple of hours with each of the participants. We were at their homes. We sat with them at their computers. Typically it was in their bedroom. Did a home tour, and then we also captured pictures, video, and artifacts, some physical artifacts that they gave us, such as posters and things that they had created, as well as the digital artifacts. And it was one researcher from Create with Context, and then typically one or two observers from Adobe that went out on these studies. So a very rich set of data that we have to pull from when we're doing this type of research. One of the favorite parts for me for this research was that we not only learned about these teens, but we're actually also working with Adobe to translate these into specific features and functions for their upcoming products. And I think as we go through these the 4 people that we're going to talk about today, you'll get a sense of some of these specific things and how they can translate over. So the first person I was going to talk about is this woman named Gina. And Gina is very much into listening to music, into talking to other people about music, but also into using music as part of her own kind of personal representation of herself out on the internet. And you'll notice through this we've changed the names and blurred some pictures and some faces and stuff like that just to keep the participants anonymous, but the underlying data is still the same. Okay, so the first thing about Gina is that she likes music, but not just to listen to it, but it's, like I said, part of this ability to create a sense of herself online from it. So for instance, she goes to this music site called iMeme, where you can go out and not only can you listen to music, but you can also kind of publish your own profile. You can publish the bands that you like to listen to. You can talk to other people about those bands. So it's a very interactive thing around this, and she's almost publishing a version of herself online that's represented through the music that she's listening to. If you look at her, she's been making websites since she was 13 years old. So, very much kind of an early publisher here. And the reason why she got into this was, and we found this across a lot of the participants, was because she was bored. For a lot of these teens, the thing that gets them into online publishing and that gets them into working with digital media is just sitting around in the summer and trying to find something to do. And so what she did is she decided to create this website to kind of as a fan site for a band that she likes. And the way that she started out was using a pre-made social media template, so one of those websites that you can go to where you can create your own kind of social media site around a particular topic. And we've noticed throughout the study that there's a lot of use and reuse of this type of technology, where people aren't these teens aren't necessarily creating things from scratch, but they are using existing infrastructure that's out there, as well as using existing media and creating their own media. So when she first got started creating things online, She said that she used Neopets, which is a fairly basic child-focused site, but fairly quickly moved on to HTML from there. But she had a friend who had created a fan site, sort of like the one that she created, that got her into this idea of creating something that was a little bit more substantive and using additional programs, additional software to do that with. So she did her first 10 layouts when she was creating her fan site using Adobe's Photoshop Elements, and she was very, very excited about Elements when she first saw it, because she said, wow, this is just, it allows me to do things like I could never do before. But then after that, she ended up in her digital media class finding out about Photoshop itself, so not the consumer Elements version, but instead the more kind of pro version. And the thing that struck us here is if you look at the kind of the creative class historically, using a product like Photoshop or Fireworks or Dreamweaver or something like that typically was required a certain level of commitment from that person. So the person says, I'm a designer, Photoshop is important to me, I'm going to go out and I'm going to get Photoshop, I'm going to buy the books, I'm going to take some classes, I'm going to dedicate a portion of my life to learning how to use this particular product in order to do my creative expression. But if you look at what Gina did, and if you look in general at the other people that we talked to, the use of this technology is much more transient. It's just a means to an end. They're just looking to, I want to create something, and I'll use whatever tool that I have at my disposal to create that thing. So the actual tool itself is a lot less important than it used to be for this age range. So she finished up this site with the help from a friend of hers. This friend is somebody who she's never met before. It's a girl in Spain that she met through the internet, through a discussion board. And it ended up where this other friend named Angel shared an FTP site with Gina in order to be able to share, post files together and work on this stuff collaboratively. For Gina, this was no big deal. The fact that there was somebody she was working with that spoke a different language, or they had, some difficulty communicating. This person was like 9 or 10 time zones away. The fact that it was, that much time and distance to do this collaboration was no big deal. It was part of the flow of getting things done, learning how to do this type of creative activity. But you also notice, after all this work, she learned 4 different software products, she met another person, she got bored with the site and moved on. So there's also a very transient nature that we saw to the type of publishing and media creation that goes on within the youth group. A little bit of an aside here, but it's something interesting. We found that Gina said that she goes out into her garage from time to time and borrows her father's spray paint, and she'll spray paint just kind of these blobs of paint on a board and then watch it run. And then she'll take a digital picture of that and she brings it back into Photoshop, and then she uses some features in Photoshop to turn those blobs of paint into brushes, so that then when she's creating her media in Photoshop, she has this brush that nobody else on earth has. And something that was very important to her and a lot of these other participants we talked to was that ability to have something that's completely unique. And that also struck us, because if you look at people that are more kind of traditional creative class, there are some that like to have the unique features, but there's also another group, especially if you're talking about, let's say, corporate design, where there's a lot of reliance on templates and kind of predefined brushes and predefined shapes and that kind of thing. For Gina, it was very important that she used something that nobody else had ever used before. One other aspect that we found, and we've done, Create with Context has done a lot of research over the years with Adobe on the Photoshop product, and as I assume a lot of you feel, there's a lot of people, myself included, where you've used Photoshop for a while and you still feel that there's just a lot more left to learn. And we've done some research with real Photoshop experts that are just absolutely amazing in using the product. And we find that even those folks tend to feel that there's more to learn, there's other ways of doing things. A very, very strong and very interesting finding for us was amongst the youth, people said things like, I've been doing this long enough that I know all the tools and I know what I want to do with them, I know how to use them, I know how they work. So for Gina, when she's using Photoshop, she might only know 10% of the product, but it's what she needs to know. She feels very comfortable with it. She doesn't feel kind of that angst that a lot of us older folks get when we touch new technology. Okay, so the second person I was going to talk about was a young woman named Patricia. And Patricia lives in the East Bay of San Francisco area. And when she grows up, she wants to go into law enforcement. So, you know, she's not looking, oh, that's one other thing I forgot to mention at the beginning, is that none of these participants that we talked to was particularly looking to grow up and become a designer. There's a couple of them that said it's something that they might do, but it wasn't necessarily a specific focus for them. So, for instance, Patricia here is very much interested in the long run in law enforcement. One of the things that we observed with her and a couple of the other folks is this transition from kind of the teen and youth and tween type of culture, which tends to be more, you know, about toys and like you see here, Batman and the cats and the 17 magazine and all that. But you also see that there's this transition that's happening, and you'll see that she's got Time magazine also sitting on the floor there. And there's this beginning to have an awareness of the larger world around you, and also some of the roles that are part of that larger world. So for instance, for Patricia, the idea of thinking about being in law enforcement. What we saw with Patricia is that she's starting to pick up on some of these roles in her online world as well, and I'll show you what I'm talking about in the next couple of slides. So Patricia created a storytelling site. So we're calling it the Packlands. It's not exactly the name of it, but just changed it slightly for the presentation. But this site is a place where people can go to the site, you sign up and you get a username and a password, and then you join in what is effectively an ongoing message board, but it's people telling stories about these wolves. So each person assumes the persona of a particular wolf or creates their own persona, and then just goes in with text and types in what happened to their wolf, and then somebody else comes in and types something in response to that. It's just kind of an ongoing story that comes out of this. She came up with this idea and created the whole concept by herself. What she did do is she reused some message board technology that was already out there to get that, you know, the infrastructure underneath it, but everything else was effectively from her mind. The interesting thing about this concept of one person writes a little bit of the story, and then the next person writes a little bit more, and then the next person writes a little bit more, and I also noticed in the chat window from a person named Morris Rosenthal, it says, he said, or she said, unfortunately, remixing is often limited to removing my copyright notices and pasting into forums. It is very much something that you see in this group, is that there's a different perspective on copyright, and there's to kind of sum up that concept. If you think about traditional creative, it tends to be file new. People go into Photoshop or they go into Dreamweaver or something like that, and they create a new document and they create something from nothing. If you look at the creative youth, what we saw there was a culture of file open. So it's open an existing document, open something that already existed, take something that somebody else has created and riff on it and create something new. So after she'd been doing this role playing for about a month or so, she got tired of just having the text representation of the characters, and she wanted to start drawing some or creating some pictures of them. So she connected up with this girl whose handle is Venomous Emma. She doesn't actually know her real name. She met this other woman through role playing on the site and began learning Photoshop from this girl. And what she did is she would create a few things. Actually, I can show you on the next page here. She would create a couple of images, and then she would send them off to this other person, and then the other person would come back and provide some feedback, and they'd go back and forth and back and forth. And if I don't know if it's easy to see on your screen, so I'll just read a brief little piece of one of the things that, one of the discussions that they're having. It says, okay, I know we both have school, but these are what I have done so far under your mentorship. I would like you to see and critique. And then the other person says, I've been managing my homework better, and I was about to start this up again with a tutorial on putting things in water. So there's a willingness to help each other out here, but it's a very ad hoc type of interaction. It's one person that meets another person randomly on a message board and chats with them, and they send emails back and forth, you know, between classes and that type of thing, in order to get this information going back and forth. Very different from kind of the current mindset around learning, which tends to be buy the product, buy the book, go to the class, and you know, a more formalized approach. One of the things we've also noticed in our research is if you look at the younger folks that are in the design industry now in the early 20s, this same approach is starting to carry through. People are having problems with figuring out a particular thing in Photoshop, for instance. Rather than going and looking in the help file or looking in a book, they're just going to go straight to Google, or they're going to go, you know, hop on IM or hop on MySpace and ask somebody that they went to school with or something along those lines. Okay, so the third person we're going to talk about is this young man named David, and this is what David looks like, except for the pixels on his face. He's 17 years old. He lives in the San Francisco Peninsula area, and is very, very much into longboarding. So longboarding being skateboarding, but with a much longer board. So it's a particular culture. It's almost a subculture to skateboarding that focuses on this particular type of board. The one thing that we found when talking to these youth is that youth typically tend to put their focus on maybe 2 or 3 particular topics when they're online. So for instance, he might be into longboarding and maybe a particular band and maybe a particular video game, let's say. And those would be pretty much the focal point of his online activity. So we don't see as broad of a spread. You know, he's not going to be on 30 or 40 different websites talking about 30 or 40 different topics. It's going to be fairly narrow. And what this does is it allows these people to become an expert in a particular area, or at least to have either something to say about it, particular expertise, or also gives them the ability to start building a reputation or some sort of a sense of self around this a particular topic.
Did you see the question?
Okay, so one of the questions went by, is there a significant difference between a message board and a user forum? I'm using those two terms completely interchangeably. Okay, so if you think about kids, youth, and social media, the first thing that tends to pop into everybody's mind is MySpace, Facebook, you know, the kind of the 800-pound gorillas in the space. One thing that we have saw throughout this study, and we've seen throughout other studies around youth and online communications and social media, is that a lot, or almost the majority of the online social activity and creative activity tends to be on these third-party sites, these niche sites that are around a particular topic. So, for instance, if you look at David, he spends a little bit of time on the Facebook and the MySpace just in order to kind of keep up with his friends. But when he's really communicating with his friends, when he's really spending a lot of time expressing himself, it's on this site. It's on the Silverfish site.
I was just going to, I think that was one of the most interesting and surprising things we found in this study. I think I don't know, I just felt in the media we had heard so much about MySpace and Facebook at the time, and then to see that people really wanted to do things around their passions and their interests, and maybe interact with people who weren't the people they already knew in school and in day-to-day life. Yeah,
because it's interesting, because there's this sense that people are just on MySpace and Facebook and they're just like sending messages back and forth, being goofy and all that. But come to find out, there's this whole other place where they're actually investing real time and real thought.
Yeah.
So when David started getting into longboarding and trying to do some things around it in online and in digital media, he started doing things like taking videos of his friends as they're going down the hill, taking photos of his friends and modifying them, things along those lines. The way he got started is he started using Photoshop in grade school, and he learned it by toying around. That's it. You know, when we typically think of these types of pieces of software, we think of the learning curve. We think of people's fear of new technology, people's fear of you know, learning how to use a particular feature. For him, no big deal. Jumped in, no learning curve. Just started playing around with it. Downloaded some tutorials off the web, and just, you know, figured out what he needed to figure out. Now he's happy with it. If you look, for instance, here's a picture that he took of a friend of his, and these guys are serious longboarders. They do the helmets and everything. What his friend is doing is he's doing a kind of going down the side of a mountain on his longboard, and then they were riding along beside and taking pictures. And it's a still frame picture. If you look at the picture on the left, it's kind of boring. You know, that's what David said. It's just not that exciting of a picture. So he went in, he found a tutorial on the web that talked about how to create a sense of motion around the photo. And then when he finished creating this photo, he didn't go put it on MySpace. He didn't go put it on Facebook. He didn't put it on Flickr. He uploaded it back up to the Silverfish longboarding site.
I was just going to pause to answer some of the questions. There's one about what is grade school, elementary school. I don't know. I'm trying to think of what's a grades 1 through 8. You'd say is grade school, 1 through 5.
Yeah, it's before high school.
Yeah. Okay, everyone's answered that too. And then I'd seen a comment earlier from Liz about the forums and things going back to the AOL days, and I mean that's what's sort of interesting too, is how old school those sort of message boards are, and how actually I don't know, when we saw these sites, they aren't impressive from a sort of user experience point of view. They're pretty vanilla.
Yeah, pretty basic interactions. It's, you know, post a message, reply to a message, upload a file, but it's not, you know, these forums don't tend to be Web 2.0 drag and drop fancy types of things. They're just places to go put your content, get yourself out there.
Hey, Kel, do you mind if I pop in with a couple questions?
Please do.
In regards to the niche sites that you're seeing, do you find that those sites are generally run by individuals? Do they form organically, or are there actual companies behind these?
It's a mix. I think for things like this, for the Silverfish longboarding, for the Packlands, the storytelling around wolves, it tends to be that there is a company that provides the infrastructure underneath it, so the actual code that runs the discussion forums and all that. But the content itself tends to be grassroots. It tends to be created through more of a grassroots thing. Now, if you're talking about things that are more aligned with the media, so about bands, about movies, you know, that side of the world, there does tend to be more influence from the more traditional, you know, publishing houses and forums.
Sure. Yeah, and that's a question that seems to pop up quite a bit, just because publishers in particular, and this expands across all forms of media. I know a lot of companies are looking at it saying, well, you know, we have targeted content. How do we generate the audience? And I just wonder with this group, with kids in particular, if there's a question of authenticity is associated with, okay, this is just a group of enthusiasts, or this is actually content that is catalyzed by some sort of corporation. I don't. Have you noticed that there's any distinction there, or does it really not matter? The kids tend to gravitate where they want to gravitate.
What we tend to see, both here and in some of the other research we've done, is if that content is put out there by a big corporation, but it's put out there in the interest of getting content out there so that people can use it, mix it, remix it, talk about it, upload it somewhere else, that tends to go over pretty well. When the owner of the content or the corporation tries to put it out there and tries to be cool or tries to restrict its usage, that tends to drive people away.
Okay, great. I guess we can keep going. Thank you.
Okay, great. And that leads us to our fourth person, which is a young man named Craig. And Craig's a 16-year-old, lives in the San Francisco Bay Area, and also very much into music. And the thing about Craig is that he was introduced to graphics by his brother a number of years ago. And his brother went to this site called planetrenders.net. So renders being tend to be these graphics that are rendered out. So somebody will create a template, and then the software will build out a texture on it, or a three-dimensionality or something like that. So there's a lot of technique to creating renders. And this site is kind of a fan site for people to be able to upload renders that they've created, talk about how they've done them, upload things for other people to download and riff off of and create their own things. But it also sponsors battles between different renderers. So two people, they'll say, create the best example of such and such, maybe a outer space scene or something like that. And then they'll have two people create renders, or a bunch of different people, and have these battles to try to figure out, who's the best renderer on this particular topic. And it gets a lot of, a very passionate following within the render fan base. And what happened is that Craig was looking at this with his brother, and he said, man, they had all these cool effects, and I just wanted to see if I could do them. It was a challenge. Craig's in high school. He's sitting around in the summer. He's bored. He's looking for something to do, and he gets excited about this. Well, what happened was not only did he download some renders and start playing with them and then start creating his own, but he also found that he had this certain knack for working with that community and talking to other people and helping other people out. What happened is, after a little while, he became the person who manages all the teams on Planet Renders. So here we have, a 16-year-old kid who effectively runs the people side of this ad hoc site. And he says, it's time-consuming. It takes up a lot of his free time, but he likes it because he gets to see inside all the teams. He gets to understand who the people are. He gets to see not only the techniques that they're using for doing the rendering, but he also gets to meet the people and have a play in that community.
I was just going to add a few things, because this is one of the visits I went to. The other interesting thing about this site was there was some sort of odd commerce model too, where you could like purchase. I don't know if you were going to talk about that, but you could purchase renders, so you sort of owned the original artwork, and then only like you could modify it, but then you could sell it back to the community. And it reminded me a lot of Second Life, because there was some exchange rate of like $1 equals 40 render dollars or something like that. But it was really, and I was asking, because I was having enough trouble understanding even what renders are and why you would make these things, because there was a very specific form factor too. They were like teeny tiny little rectangles. So I was like, well, just because you bought it doesn't mean that someone else can't, like, the person who sold it to you could sell it again. But it seemed like there was some sort of shared sense of, well, that that wouldn't be right. So, so there's a sort of, I was thinking of the copyright issues people were posting before. They sort of had come to their own terms of how they thought fair use of content was.
Yeah, we have seen, we've been doing research around this topic, around copyright and sharing and things like that, for a couple of years now, and we've actually seen a shift from the Napster days, when it was, if I can right-click on it, it's mine. And it's starting to shift now, and there's still a very large community that just grabs anything and copies and ignores copyright. But within this community of people who have an artistic sense, who have created something on their own, who are remixing from other people, you actually start to see, even in this age range, some awareness of copyright and some awareness of asking the original person if they can reuse it, if it's going to be published in something formal, or if they're going to get paid for it. So there's some beginning inklings around that, and I think this example that Julie mentioned is really just a perfect example of that, which is somebody creates this render, they throw it out there, and they sell it, and it's a digital good. Anybody could sell these things, or anybody could resell it. But there's kind of a gentle person's agreement within that community to follow the rules of the community. One of the things that Craig does is he enforces some of the rules around Planet Renders. So enforces the rules the battles, monitoring to see if people are doing inappropriate things. He's effectively got a full-time adult job on the side, but he just does it due to passion. We're going to look at a couple of questions here real quick.
Yeah. Yeah, the comment about women, he actually, like the other participants, mentioned having that, I think someone in, Canada who he was exchanging Photoshop tips and tutorials on how to do things. So I think there might have been a woman who had been running part of the site too before. Again, I have no gut understanding of that site in particular. I spent a lot of time looking at it, trying to understand it, because it's definitely niche.
When you say, Morris said, hard to run a business on those numbers and stay around for a long time, you do find that for a lot of these sites, it's a passion thing. It's people wanting to connect with other people, using a particular technology or topic or something as a way to connect with other people. But we didn't, from talking to all these folks, we didn't really see anybody that's trying to make money off of this passion, off of this, the creativity that they're doing.
Yeah, and some of them were posting on bigger communities like DeviantArt, which I think has more in the maybe million range of users. And they would use sites like DeviantArt also to get inspiration, look for ideas, look for tutorials, follow artists that they like on DeviantArt.
As far as the question about have we noticed any change in relation to copyright as these kids age, I think not as the kids age, but as the entire marketplace evolves. I think over the last 2 to 3 years, there's an increasing awareness. I don't think we'll ever get to the point, at least from the people we've talked to here, and extrapolating forward. I don't necessarily see us getting to back to the point of traditional copyright, where everything needs to be double-checked before you can use it, and nobody will do remixes and all that. I don't see us getting to that point, but I do see an increasing awareness coming out of it.
But yeah, we definitely, even talking with the pros and other groups, there's so much talk about open source, things like Creative Commons. There's a sort of, I think there's some loosening up in certain areas, but then of course you've got other people who, like a Disney, people who will defend their copyrights and IP to the bitter end.
Right, and it's, when you see people remixing, a lot of times it actually helps to increase the distribution of the underlying media and get greater visibility for it. Unfortunately, sometimes it's not traceable back to where it came from, but it is a way that people are starting to spread stuff around. Okay.
There were like a whole bunch of other. Yeah, I think that, it is interesting if they would feel ownership with copyright, or if maybe at this age they might just be flattered that someone would steal their work too. So I think it could go both ways.
Regarding whether or not the online collaborations led to offline friendships, from the people we talked to in this study, typically no. And it was typically because these people were so far-flung globally. On one of these sites, you might have people logging in from Spain and from Australia and from Japan and from the U.S., and it just didn't tend to drive through to offline friendships. However, when the collaborations were around a particular topic like the longboarding, it happened that the initial reason for getting on the site was because there was a group of people that did longboarding together. They all kind of collectively ended up on the site together, and then they met new local people through that. As accomplishment in a creation accumulates, do you sense that people are becoming more proprietary? Until there is a full-time job based on that, we haven't seen that. If anything, we've actually seen people want to get their stuff out there as much as possible. What they really don't want is somebody else to say they create, I create a piece of media. I don't want somebody else to say they created my piece of media. But if somebody else takes my stuff and build something on top of it, I like that, typically is what we've seen.
Yeah, and you remind me of the participants in the study too, where they'd seen something from one of their classmates they liked. That person gave them the file and gave them the brushes so that they could essentially make the same thing. And then they sort of called it their own picture when they showed it to us, but when they described how they made it, it turned out that, well, really someone else had done most of the work.
Mm-hmm.
And, we.
And it tends to be that that first person wasn't all that upset about the fact that this other person had, quote, quote, appropriated their content and used it for something else.
Yeah, that was the thing that interested me. I have a background more in education, was seeing how much peer tutoring and mentoring they were doing, but just on their own. I think educators would love to design a program in which everybody, the students were teaching each other things and creating tutorials, but they're creating all this educational content on how to make things. And the other interesting thing we saw around that, I think it was one of the one that maybe you did the Wolves, where when they're looking for how to do things, they aren't looking for how do I use Photoshop or how do I use the brush tool. They're looking for how do I make rain? I want to make rain. So they were coming into things from having a vision of what they wanted, and those would become their keywords to say, like, rain, I want to make rain, I want to make a blur, I want to make something look fast. Mm-hmm. So that was something that was very interesting to us.
Yeah, very much more outcome-based learning rather than tool-based learning. So if you look across the folks that we talked about today as well as the other ones that we talked to, there were 7 themes that came out of that. And these themes we used, Create with Context used with Adobe when we went into the next phase of the process in order to start coming up with some product and feature ideas. This was kind of the rolling up of everything we learned to seed that process. And it was expression, so youth are using creative media in order to establish who they are within their community, whether that community is online or offline, global or local. Also, the theme of belonging, so wanting to belong to a particular smaller community. So for instance, the Planet Renders, the longboarding site, all of those things are a way for these youth to belong to something and contribute to something. Inspiration, so emulating and following other people. One of the themes that we didn't talk about as much today, but was one of the things that came out, was what Julie touched on briefly, was this idea of going out and finding things that other people have done in the past, tutorials and different ways of creating content, and emulating how other people have done that and following other people and the type of media that these other people are creating over time and learning from those folks. Learning is watching, doing, and learning on the fly. So very much, watching other people do things, either online or off, and learning as you go along. So you don't sit down, learn the tool first, and then create something. You just sit down and start creating and learn the pieces of the tool that you need as you're creating and publishing it. Helping the global apprentice. It's funny that the vocabulary of apprenticeship is actually fairly strong in this space, where people speak of themselves as apprentices and mentors. Co-designing, if you think of design over the years, there's been kind of this lone designer persona that's out there. Everything that these people are doing was co-designed. Everything started from something somebody else did, or started from a tutorial from someone else, or started with help from someone else, and brought that forward. And then also velocity was a big theme. Almost everything these folks create is transient throwaway media. It's something you create in order to express a particular feeling or establish yourself in a community or something along those lines. Once it wears off, you throw it away. I mean, the perfect example of that was at the beginning with Gina, who created an entire website around the Panic at the Disco, that band, and within just a couple of years afterwards, completely abandoned the site. So that's generally the 7 big themes that we saw coming out of this. What I'm going to do now is hand it back over to Julie, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about what we're doing about this and what's next.
Yeah. And I was just going to answer the question about the lower income kids. I'd say most of these kids were sort of very middle income. Often there was a computer in the house, but they were maybe sharing. The adult in the family was done with some old computer, but they'd sometimes put it in a more public space, or they had to share it with their brothers and sisters. A lot of these kids had siblings. I think actually a bunch of them were twins. So there was, but they were from, even though we're in California, we drove pretty far outside of the Silicon Valley where the Adobe office is.
So we're reading the question real quick.
Yeah, I see, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we're reading the latest last 2 or 3 entries there.
Yeah.
Okay.
The sort of big takeaways for us was about this changing and what it means to publish. You know, you think about, 20 years ago, the only thing kids really worked on was maybe like the school yearbook, and you'd spend all year on that. At the end, you'd have a yearbook. But now there's all these ongoing activities that they're participating in a public sphere too. So that the site with the wolves, that's just a public site that anybody can participate in. It's not just limited to the kids or to the kids and their immediate friends. And then it's, it is ongoing and woven into their daily lives and their summers and their downtime. I was particularly interested by the whole expression of the word boredom with the kids, because I can't remember how long it's been since I've had time to actually be bored. I was like, oh, what was that like to be bored and not to have 200 other things you should be doing? But I think that's a potentially ripe area for people to think about that and say, okay, what things, could kids be doing? But understand they're coming at it because they're bored and they're just trying to kill some time and find something that sort of engages them for a period of time until, perhaps they do go to college or get a job and that free time starts to evaporate, sadly. And the other thing I think is that the tools are changing too. You don't have to be an InDesign user to do something that would have been considered publishing 10 or 15 years ago. You can go and build out compelling stories and documents and websites and spaces with just using websites themselves. And the kids are also open to any tools. They don't seem to have a sense of, I don't know, they seemed less picky. Some of the websites they showed us, there's this site, Tutorialized. It's all full of tutorials. And it's covered in ads. And to me, it looks garish, and I wouldn't want to use it. But, for them, it's fine. So I think they have certain ways, I think, of perceiving the sites, too, where they screen out some of the clutter and some of the junkiness of some of these less corporate sites that are more homegrown. And I think, like we've mentioned before, just the way learning is really changing and that there's more influence. And this is true of kids in education in general, that the peer influence is the strongest influence in their lives. So they're going to want to do things that other kids are doing or learn from other kids. I think that's what's interesting, too, is unlike adults who might be participating in a community, the kids are really actively looking for the critiques and the feedback and trying to do better and trying to do different things. They don't come like fully formed to any of these sites, no matter what they're working on. The question about the parenting or elder mentoring, it was all the ones that I saw was coming from other people in the communities. They didn't often mention their parents. Some of them had parents who were technical, so for more of the stories like, oh, I built this computer with my dad, like on that side. But I think my sense was they were doing these things on the computer without a parent looking over their shoulders. But the software licensing, that's a very good question.
Speaking of Liz's question about licensing, there was one person, let's see, I think it was actually Gina, who, here's a perfect example of copyright with the youth, is that Gina wanted to use a particular software product and didn't have enough money to buy it. So she and her friend pooled their money together and bought one copy of it. Now, I'm assuming everybody probably right now is thinking, okay, so they stole one copy and they bought another. What they actually did is they bought one copy of it, and then they would uninstall it and reinstall it on the other person's machine each time they wanted to trade it back and forth. It would be like a month each person would have it. They're very aware of the copyright restrictions around it and respected that as really kind of an interesting thing.
And so,
yeah, mind if I jump in real quick?
Go ahead.
Just had a couple of things. First off, I seem to have gotten booted off of the interface, so I apologize, and I can't actually see anything right now, but I'm still on the phone, so I guess I got that going for me. So I think I appreciate that you're looking through the questions that are coming in. If you can continue to do that, that would be great while I try to get logged back on. But there was one question that I wanted to bring up, and it's something that I've seen quite a bit recently in broader conversations, but Do you feel that kids these days see any distinction between professional and amateur? And if there are distinctions, do you think that that continues to hold and there are opportunities there for people who make, quote-unquote professional content? And if there aren't distinctions, what does that mean for future content consumption and content creation?
Yeah, I don't think we got, they never brought that up. They would show us sites and other people they admired, but I don't think they really could tell the difference between, they might be able to look at the content and say, oh, I really like, one of them showed us just some website, I think it was actually of a professional designer, but I'm not sure if they look at that and they know they like it, but I'm not sure if they can think, oh, behind that lies a person who is a professional and being paid to do this work versus someone on DeviantArt who might just be another 18-year-old. I'm not sure how much they can look at what they see and then project to who could be the actual person behind that who has a job. Because, when you're, my sense is when you're in high school and what do you want to be when you grow up? They're like, a lawyer, a law officer. They don't. I'm not sure they really understand these design professions in particular too. Because we did see them, we think, wow, they have a lot of talent. They could probably be in all these roles, but they wouldn't even be exposed to those roles. So I'm not sure how much they understood what professional content is.
Yeah, they could sense something was professionally done, but they didn't think through it to go back one level deeper and say, did that come from a professional or not?
Okay, great.
Yeah, and I think that's true. They have no context for work, or at least in my day, your context for work is more like a Burger King or a job as a receptionist or something that's not. And I do feel like in our education system in our country too, the sort of more specialized arts like graphic arts versus being an artist, you might understand, oh, there's painters in the world, but that there's people who are digital painters and work in Hollywood you might not ever think to get to.
We only have a few minutes left, so if there were additional points that you wanted to go through, please go ahead. If not, I've got a couple of additional questions that we could potentially close with. So whichever you would prefer to do.
Yes, this is just our last slide. We're just going to mention that we're still working on some projects coming out of this, some more beta things and things on labs and some things with our educational, with our learning group at Adobe. And so, yeah, we're happy to talk to a couple more questions in the last remaining minutes.
And
I should just say, too, if you want to contact us for anything further, feel free to email Bill or I.
And I apologize again if I'm not able to directly address any of the questions that popped up. If you see any that emerged in the chat window that you'd like to take on, please feel free to do so. But I just wanted to loop back to this idea of the transient nature of both of the content and the sites that a lot of these kids are visiting. And I've seen that myself just in some of the social networking stuff. If you look at the sort of fickle migration between Friendster and MySpace and Facebook, that transient nature, do you think that that is something that is sort of part of the overall experience that these kids are going through, or do you think that it's a phase? And also, what do you think that that means for companies and services and publishers who are actually trying to provide material to this group? Is that fickle nature something that needs to be acknowledged in whatever plan they're doing, or are there ways of potentially countering that?
I would say that there's probably two things going on. One is that as companies come up with new things, you have MySpace and Facebook and then Twitter. So sometimes people are moving because there's something kind of more cool. But I think what also happened with MySpace was like there are older kids on it, then the younger kids want to be there. So then the older kids move, and then the younger kids get onto Facebook. So there's also some of that too, that drift of the kids trying to find themselves. And they're, like I think people have pointed out in some of the questions, they're aging as things happen too. So what you might have thought like 17 magazine, mostly read by what, like 11 and 12-year-olds. Like, you're constantly moving, so you're going to throw that away and get Vogue now because you think that makes you older. So I feel, and I feel this for some of the projects we work on Adobe, you have to expect that with the younger communities, or even the older ones, they might just move. So you can't spend 2 years planning something and then launch it because what you think was cool, it took you forever to build, suddenly 18 other things have cropped up that are more interesting to people. So I think you have to accept that people will be in multiple places too, not just try to say, oh, well, they're all on my site, and I want to be the site that offers everything about longboarding to everyone, so it's a one-stop shop. It's like I think you have to accept that they will find other places to share their interest in whatever the topic is. My 2 cents.
And if I could just do a follow-up question on that too. If that is just part of the way that it is, should people who are developing content, putting material out there, should they be focusing on solving particular problems or providing particular resources or creating particular experiences rather than trying to attract an audience, particularly if it's kids, around a brand or a topic? Is it, it seems like particularly the kids that are in the case studies that you showed, that they were looking to do things. They weren't necessarily looking to, be associated with a particular group. It was they found the group and then they wanted to actively engage. And so is there an opportunity out there for publishers, content creators, whatnot, to focus on that rather than saying, okay, well, I'm going to create my own group and I'm going to get these kids to come and look at my stuff?
Yeah, I think both have a place. So there's one place which is if you're a content creator and you've got content and you put it out there in what would be considered an honest way amongst these youth, that can work. It can very much work. Another approach is to create the infrastructure that these youth can publish into. I believe the longboarding site sits on top of the exact same software that is used for 100 different topics. So it's creating those infrastructure pieces that allow people to build these things themselves. There's kind of 2 different angles on it. And then also, if it is created, sponsored content, having a way for youth to interact with that content both on the site where the content comes from, but also elsewhere. Moving that content elsewhere, riffing on it, creating mashups with it, doing other things, and not fighting that, and allowing that to happen, and just using that as a natural way to, in the long run, point people back to the source of the content.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And unless there are any additional questions that you saw through the chat interface, we probably should wrap it up at this point. So just take a quick look. If there's anything you'd like to address, let me know. Otherwise, I'll close things out.
Just one quick message. As Murphy's Law has it, I'm having problems with my email server today. So if you try to send me an email and I don't respond at bill@createwithcontext.com, just send me another one or give me a call on the phone number there.
And I would just, Morris and Annabelle's story is very true about YouTube, because I looked up how to make a toga for my son for Halloween and found a video on YouTube of some frat brother explaining how to make a toga and go at a party. And I'm trying to explain to my son, don't listen to this part. Just watch how to fold the sheet. He's 8 years old. Anyway, thanks everyone very much.
Hi everyone, this is Catherine again. I just want to thank you guys for doing a fascinating presentation. Thank you, Mac, for enduring the technical issues that we had this time. And we'll have a recording of this available very quickly and send a link to everyone who's participated in it. Mac?
I also just wanted to thank you both for doing this today. It was really interesting. And for everybody who is listening and hopefully was able to remain on the line. I apologize for any of the technical issues that you may have encountered. Julie and Bill will both be presenting at the upcoming Tools of Change for Publishing Conference in New York City, and that's held February 9th through the 11th, so it's just around the corner. So if you'd like additional information on that, registration info, all that, you can visit toccon.com. That's toccon.com. And as Catherine mentioned, we will be posting the full video and archive of this very soon, and you'll get a notification when that's done. So thank you both again for a really interesting presentation.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.